Greetings and welcome to this replica recording of a presentation from the Georgia Library Instruction, Teaching, and Reference Virtual Conference from the summer of 2021, What's Old Becomes New Again. It's on my 4-year experience of compiling and submitting and getting published a fairly large subject bibliography project. This recording is necessitated by technological fail at the conference. Several of the presentations delivered, the recordings didn't take, so they've asked a few of us to provide recordings for the YouTube channel. So this is that effort. It's being done on June 24th, and to complete the full disclosure, it's being done on equipment provided for the use of Perimeter College staff and faculty by Georgia State University, and on a platform, the Kaltura Video Cloud platform, provided for use by staff and faculty of Perimeter College at Georgia State University. I am beholden to its quality in terms of how the video turns out, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that this will be a presentable presentation. A brief overview of what the presentation is going to cover, really 3 major points. We're going to first look at the background matter of the subject of the film, of the bibliography project that I did, which was film noir, a subcategory of film studies that embraces a cross-section of other disciplines, including literary criticism and cultural history and women's studies and a whole host of others, all of which are represented in interesting ways in the bibliography itself. And then we'll look at the process that I used to compile the bibliography and to get it published, and we'll briefly look at the end at the bibliography itself, its contents, and its value in this day and age. But first, the kind of create the background and a glossary of terms that we'll be throwing around a little bit during the presentation. For context, your frame of reference, the fundamental question that we have to answer is, what is film noir? And for my purposes, and following really a significant number of film scholars, the term refers to a uniquely new type of Hollywood films that appeared roughly between 1941 and 1959. Essentially, you can think of the film noir historical cycle as being, in this classic period, about the advent of the U.S. military involvement in World War II, and ended with the pivotal cultural and political year of 1959. 1959, if you're curious about why that year, Fred Kaplan has an excellent book on the power and importance of 1959 in terms of U.S. history, world history and development, culture, politics, etc. It's also interesting to note, and this is not insignificant, it's not coincidental, the first commercial television sets were sold in the United States in 1946. And by the end of 1959, more than 85% of households in the United States had one. So this period where these films appeared, and they were new and they were different, when they appeared in the 40s and 50s, we're at the tail end of the cycle of the historical period in which Americans in particular were getting their entertainment by going to the movie theaters. By 1959, going into the 1960s, that shifted to television sets in the living room, and that changed the way Hollywood made films. So, looking at the distinctive phrase film noir itself, that phrase was coined by a French critic named Nino Franck in 1946 when he used it in reference to these dark Hollywood films that were making their first appearance in France. France has always had a large audience for American films, for Hollywood product. Their critics also wrote quite a lot about them. During the Nazi occupation of France in World War II, anything from the U.S. was verboten. So there was no distribution of U.S. films during the period when film noir was just beginning. So in 1946, several of them arrived all at once, and they were jarringly different to French viewers and French audiences and to the critics. And Nino Franck was the first to write about how dark and cynical and different these films were, and he coined the phrase film noir, meaning black film, dark film. to describe this new set of Hollywood movies that hadn't been seen before in France. The film noir as a descriptive term didn't really gain acceptance in the U.S. until after the publication of a book by Raymond Board and Etienne Chaumeton. Forgive my pronunciation, it's terrible. The book was titled Panorama du Film Noir Américain, or Panorama of American Film Noir. That book was published in 1955. Remember that the cycle that we're talking about, the historical period, ends in 59. That book wasn't even translated into English until the early 1970s. A few American filmmakers, directors, producers, and a few film critics were reading the book in French by the late 1950s. But the term film noir to describe these films did not catch hold in the American parlance until the 1960s and beyond. So it's interesting that the entire historical cycle of these films that we're talking about, that this bibliography covers, were not called film noir until after the fact, kind of a post facto reality. And continuing to answer the question, really, what is film noir? I'm going to give you a little quote from Nathaniel Rich, who wrote a book that was published in 2005 called San Francisco Noir. He alludes that these films were punctuated by a new, more realistic violence, barely getting past the production code censors. And they were pervaded with a profound sense of dread and moral uncertainty. The protagonists in these films tended to be cynical, tough, and overwhelmed by sinister forces beyond their control. And the films were shot in black and white. They were lit for night, and they favored obsessive use of shadows, and perhaps most importantly, they took place in a city. Film noir tried to make sense of the complexities and anxieties of the post-war urban experience by exploring the rotten underside of the American city, the place where American dreams go to die. A little bit overwrought, but actually it's impactful and evocative of what these films did to people who saw them when they were new and different in the 40s and the early 50s. So in retrospect, you would then have to look at what it is that film noir would be defined as. And the first and most logical place that people would go is it a genre? And many will argue that film noir is a genre unto itself. Early on in the film studies movement in universities and colleges in the U.S., by the early 70s, film studies programs were being founded, and so there was a lot more writing and a lot more thinking and a lot more research being done on films in general. And the genre theory of film noir was making a strong appearance early on in a number of scholars, and you'll find some cited in a bibliography at hand. And even as recently as 2011, William Park, in his book, What is Film Noir?, was defending the position that film noir is a genre. And there has been an argument, a debate about whether film noir is a genre or not throughout the time period from the appearance of these films in the 40s and 50s to the present day. It's difficult to defend from a historicist standpoint for me because no production crew who was making a film at the time in the 40s and 50s knew that they were making a film noir. Now, if you were making a genre picture like a Western, everybody who showed up on the set knew they were making a Western. If you were making a horror film, everyone who walked onto the set knew that they were making a horror film. But no one who made a film noir during the classic period in the 40s and 50s knew they were making a film noir when they were making it. That makes it a little tough to consider it a genre when you can only call it a genre post facto. Another proposition for what is film noir is that it's a style. This gets a lot of play in a number of scholars throughout the years, including Thomas Schatz in his book Hollywood Genres, took time out from discussing various genres to declare that film noir was not a genre, but merely a style. My problem with style as being the sole descriptor for what film noir is that the implication merely always seems to be lingering right in front of the word style. Style was very important to what film noirs were and how people identify them, particularly the visual style. But it's not just the visual style that you take into account when you are determining whether a film is a noir film or not. So while it's valuable and accurate to talk about the style of noir films, it is not by itself an adequate descriptor for what is film noir. Historical movement or cycle is another descriptive way of defining film noir that has taken some scholars by storm and still gets talked about. It was certainly an historical movement. When you talk about the classic cycle of noir films, we're talking about a specific time period, the 40s and 50s essentially. There have been noir and neo-noir films made after that historical cycle, but they are not the classic, real, pure thing. Most of them are homages, most of them are period pieces, most of them are kind of nods to the historical movement. But the historical movement were films that were speaking in that moment to the people in that moment, of that moment. And that's why some scholars want to lean on this as being the most important descriptor for what film noir is. The question is whether this particular historical period determined its art any more than any other historical period. Every historical period has art that describes it, that speaks from it, that addresses issues relevant to it, and kind of is identified as time goes by with a particular period. And it's certainly true that the classic cycle of noir films was in a unique historical moment. But the decade immediately preceding the film noir cycle, the Great Depression period, was also an outrageous historical moment. And it did not have a movement or cycle that produced this kind of film. And by the way, the last 5 years that you and I have been living have been unique in a kind of outrageous historical moment. We don't yet know what the art that's going to speak from and address the issues in this moment in time is going to ultimately be. We'll know in years to come. But while that is an important distinction to say that these particular things were going on in this historical moment, and that determines why these films appeared when they did, that is an important piece to consider, but it can't be the only piece to consider. It's just not satisfactory as an exclusive descriptor of what is film noir. The cross-generic form theory, or transgeneric form, has taken hold in recent years, and there's a lot of value in this for a variety of reasons. The most significant scholar, by the way, to posit this theory of what is film noir is J.P. Talat, who just recently, in the last couple of months, retired from more than 4 decades at the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. He is hands down the most prolific scholar, the most prolific writer on film noir. He's represented by more than twice as many citations in the bibliography at hand than any other author. There's not even a close second. And he posits and makes a strong case in some of his writings that film noir is a form. It has a lot of elements to it that can be identified, and that they run across genres or sometimes transcend genres, so that you can see genre pictures like a Western that has noir elements that could be, in fact, a noir Western. There are noir horror films from the classic cycle as well, that the noir elements kind of transcend the horror genre. It's still a horror film, but it's definitely a noir horror film. So this has an awful lot of credence to it. It carries a lot of weight among scholars, and it may be the most satisfying if we had to limit ourselves to a single defining descriptor of what is film noir. But it's important to remember this really fundamental truth. There is no universally accepted definition of film noir. No one yet has agreed on, no scholars have yet agreed on one universal definition. All of those terms, genre, style, historical movement, transgeneric form, all of these appear in the literature on film noir, and sometimes they appear in combination, and in any combination may be used in discussing a particular noir film or the phenomenon at large. But again, so many people are writing about film noir, and the scholarship is only increasing over the years. More has been written in recent decades than in the time period when the film noirs were being produced, and it's only increased decade by decade as time has gone by. So as the interest keeps increasing, we still have people who are using very subjective criteria for determining what is a film noir. They recognize one when they see one. They may not agree with everybody about whether or not a certain film is a noir film, but they think they see one when they see it. So that's the interesting phenomenon about these noir films, and they spark a lot of interest and a lot of discussion and a lot of argument among scholars. We need to move beyond category, though, and look at some of the common elements that are generally accepted to be in these individual films. The first thing to make note of is that the setting of these films, again shot in the 40s and 50s, was the present in these pure noir films. The contemporaneous world that seemed corrupted and without a moral center. Cynicism was pervasive. They reflected the looming realities, kind of the dark cloud hanging overhead of at first in the period, totalitarianism. Stalin and Hitler were coming on the scene. World War II then came along, then the threat of nuclear destruction after Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Then the Cold War and the Red Scare and the witch hunt, the communist witch hunt, with Joe McCarthy and the Senate going after the Army and the State Department, and in particular the House Un-American Activities Committee, which made a point of going after Hollywood. There were hearings that they put essentially Hollywood producers and writers and actors on trial. There were some who went to jail, the infamous Hollywood 10, the witch hunt that was the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is the time period that these films were being made. By the way, some of these films addressed that very fact. Also, other issues that were going on at the time, the dark cloud overhead of social inequality and classism, the corruption and power of the government and the press, or what we would call now the media. Some of these issues still strike a chord with us more than half a century later because some of these issues are still very prevalent in our society. So these are some of the things that we're kind of looking at in general, and some specific elements to be found in noir films of the classic period include its visual style. And we need to go quickly through this because of time, but the visual style is not always present. There are disagreements about what the first noir film was, but many scholars want to start the film noir cycle with Maltese Falcon in 1941. It was released in October of 1941. That film does not have a noir visual style. It is brightly lit, kind of awash in bright light from overhead and in every direction, the way 30s films were typically made. So it doesn't have the visual style, but it's still considered a noir film because of other elements. A film released just 4 or 5 weeks after the Maltese Falcon, called I Wake Up Screaming, is a film that has the visual style of noir and other elements. It is very dark. It is very shadowy. And so different people will have the beginning of their canon of classic noir films either at the Maltese Falcon or at I Wake Up Screaming. Some will put it at a few other films from right around the same period. But the visual style can be traced to inspirations from the paintings of Edward Hopper. If you can picture in your mind the painting Nighthawks by Hopper, you'll get a sense of the visual kind of look that art directors and cinematographers were going for at the request of a director. Also, the crime scene photographs of Ouija. You can look Ouija up on the web. He's a fascinating character. He was almost clairvoyant as an independent crime scene photographer. He would sometimes get to a crime scene before the police did and take the most lurid shots that he would sell to tabloid newspapers who loved to splice them, their gory images across the front page of their paper. There's even one infamous incident when Ouija arrived at the crime scene before the crime occurred. So he was a fascinating character. His real name was Arthur Fellig, but you can Google Ouija Edward Hopper to see the kinds of looks that we're talking about. By the way, there's a number of films that we can point to that researchers, historians know the paintings of Edward Hopper were specifically used to create the artistic style of the way the film was shot, the way the sets were designed. And one that's interesting to watch, because it's an extraordinary film at a number of levels, is Force of Evil from 1948. It is known that the director had the cinematographer and the art director both looking through a book that contained Edward Hopper reproductions in it, and they discussed the look of the film. But there's also an interesting moment, a turning point in the narrative toward the end of the film, when the kidnapping of one character and the murder of another is announced to the protagonist by a Ouija-styled photograph on the front page of a newspaper, declaring, the gore and the horror of the incident. So these are things that inspired the look of film noir. German expressionist cinema kind of developed the techniques in the 20s and 30s for this kind of dark cinema. Chiaroscuro lighting is the common term used to describe shadowy lighting, minimal lighting, low key. Some cinematographers were fond of taking away all the overhead lights. If you look at films from the 30s, they were all done on sound stages. They all had dozens of 5,000 watt Klieg lights overhead, so that there is just a wash of light that is completely unnatural, unlike anyone's home, unlike any outdoor activity that you could have. And these noir films tended to have lighting from the side. They would use shadows covering half of a face to communicate something, or a whole face to communicate something else, to create the kind of disorientation and darkness of mood that the filmmakers were after. Also, cliched kinds of use of shadows were developed in these noir films. The cliche of shooting a character with Venetian blind shadows bisecting their face and their body to indicate to the audience at the time that they were behind bars, as it were, that they were in a trap of some kind. So those things were developed and exploited a lot during this noir cycle. They also were using a lot of canted angles, like the image you see here from the still from this picture. Dutch angles, they were referred to, where the distorted angles would create disorientation in the viewer and express the kind of emotional state that the characters were going through, because they were also in a canted state. They were askew in the world. And also, and this is a technological development, during the World War II, they rapidly developed smaller cameras that could be handheld, that would still shoot 35 or even 70 millimeter film. The 70 millimeter film shot in films in the 30s was still being shot with these gigantic Panavision cameras that were on dollies. The entire contraption weighed hundreds of pounds and were ponderous to move around. When the war started, the Office of War Information and others knew that we needed to document what was going on in the field, so that cameras were quickly developed that could be carried on the shoulder of a single person who followed the troops through the trenches onto the battlefields and could shoot 35 millimeter movie cinema quality film in natural light on higher speed films and film stock, and without needing to drag a dolly around or build tracks for the camera to move upon. So these cameras now became available to classic movie makers, and they could then move away from the soundstage. They could move into real locations. They could actually shoot inside of apartment buildings. They could shoot outside on the street. They could use natural light. They could use limited light sources to create darker images that would still be picked up by the film stock and be able to be copied and shown in theaters to create a new kind of look, a new kind of mood, a new kind of way of communicating the message of the narrative. So that's a little bit about the visual style. Also, the narrative style is important. The hard-bitten Pulp Fiction, the Black Mask series of Pulp Fiction that was extremely popular. The kind of thing that people tended to hide, under their jacket or in a briefcase. They didn't, it was a little bit lurid and a little bit dicey and racy. Also was the place that gave start to a lot of really good authors like Raymond Chandler and James M. Cain and Dashiell Hammett. They wrote short stories for The Black Mask, and they published short stories and novels in the 30s that then became the first source material for the noir films when they began in the 40s. Of about 35 or so noir films that were produced before the end of World War II, only 2 were scripted from original stories. All the rest were from plays and especially short stories that had already been written. They were adaptations of existing source material. That changed over the course of time because screenwriters began to get into the rhythm of these films and could create a story on their own. But the first wave of these noir films used mostly source material from published authors like Chandler. Ernest Hemingway is another one. Ernest Hemingway provided stories that were adapted for a couple of very significant noir films. So the pulp fiction of the time, that became the source material to be adapted for these films. One of the unique characteristics of a lot of these pulp short stories was that they were told in the first person. You had, in the case of the Continental Op or Philip Marlowe or Sam Spade characters in these short stories, they were telling the story and they were telling it from their own perspective. So the way that was replicated in these films was to use voiceover narration. Now, voiceover narration was not new in Hollywood films, but voiceover narration had typically been omniscient narrating, the voice of God narrator. And these films were different in that it was the protagonist in the film who was telling the story, and the protagonist may not know any more than the audience does. And in some cases, the protagonist is actually telling something that is untrue to the audience. So that's another thing that disoriented the audience and kind of kept them on the edge of their seat, kept them trying to keep up with what was going on in the narrative. And this was a new and kind of a different way of approaching these films. So another aspect of a different and new narrative style. The other important thing is the nonlinear storytelling, the non-chronological storytelling. They often use flashbacks in these films. Now, flashbacks are also an age-old technique in Hollywood films, but the way they used flashbacks in these noir films was different. Often there would be a flashback within a flashback, and in some cases a flashback within a flashback within a flashback. And there are some fairly notorious examples of real Byzantine story structure when you start getting these layers of flashbacks and jumping back and forth in chronology in these stories. A classic example is The Big Sleep, which was a Raymond Chandler novel, and the film came out in 1946. The screen adaptation, the screenplay, was being worked on, believe it or not, by William Faulkner and Lee Brackett, and they were meeting together to work on the screenplay for The Big Sleep, and they couldn't figure out who killed the chauffeur. So they decided, well, let's call Chandler and find out. So they called Raymond Chandler and said, hey, in The Big Sleep, who killed the chauffeur? And Raymond Chandler, the author of the book's response was, I don't know. So that just goes to prove that narrative incoherence never got in the way of a good story for these film noir filmmakers. So let's look also at character types. Briefly, we can run over the investigator character quickly. We don't need to talk about that much. You can sort of see that when you see these films. Also, there's always somebody who's being haunted by something or pursued by something, a person, an idea, their past, their identity. The character type that is most important in these films and has been written about a lot and has become iconic is the femme fatale character, the fatal woman. The femme fatale character is important because, well, among other reasons, this is the character that feminist scholars early on gravitated toward and have kind of redeemed from a bad reputation to a good reputation because the femme fatale character was the first Hollywood female character type who controlled her own power, her own destiny. They are the ones in these films that have the power. The femme fatale is the one who controls the men around them. In the films that led up to this time period, the women in the films tended to be subservient to the men. They weren't allowed to have their own ideas. They weren't allowed to control their own fate. They had to be obedient. They had to be eye candy. They were domestic. They were otherwise subjugated, and they were not fully formed, real human characters in their own right. These femme fatale characters in these noir films of the 40s and 50s were really well-formed human characters and the most interesting characters in a lot of these films. Feminist scholars embraced and wrote about them in great, well, with great aplomb and in great numbers over the years, and they still are. In addition to the cliche femme fatale character that you would automatically think of, who uses as the chief method for getting power over a man using sex, there are also femme fatale characters who fit an Oedipal subplot in these films. Some of the femme fatale characters were the mothers of the protagonists. And so you have this whole Oedipus kind of relationship, with the mother that created another psychological layer in these films that was new and was challenging to the audience and was also extremely interesting and extremely, fertile ground for storytelling. There are several examples of that. There's an obscure little film called Christmas Holiday that has an Oedipal subplot. One that large numbers of you might have seen is a film from 1949 called White Heat that has James Cagney sadly miscast, a 30s style actor in a 40s noir film. But he is the protagonist and his mother is the femme fatale. That you may remember that film because in the climactic scene he commits suicide atop a large storage tank at a oil refinery, and he blows himself up and the oil refinery calling out to his mother as he does so. So that you may remember that one. That's an example of a femme fatale that is the mother of the protagonist, and the Oedipus subplot is significant throughout that film and many others. By the way, there are examples of homme fatales where the fatal character is actually a man, not just a villain in the kind of superficial way that 30s gangster films had villain types, or that earlier stage plays would have a villain like a Snidely Whiplash. These homme fatales were way more complex characters, way more twisted psychologically, way more complex as characters and more fully formed. The Prowler from 1951 is an interesting example of that. Gilda from 1946 is another film that some of you may have seen that has an homme fatale. And there are even, and these are some really interesting ones, there are even some noir films that have the added twist of a gay homme fatale. Like, for example, the film Laura from 1944 has Clifton Webb playing the gay homme fatale. That is a neat trick to get past the censors in the 40s and 50s. It was a difficult thing to do. You couldn't telegraph it, you couldn't say it out loud, but Clifton Webb, who was gay, played his character in a way that the audience of the time knew this was a gay man and what his relationship and role with the females and with the others was, and accepted that without having to have it unpacked by a narrator or having any telegraphed signs. They understood by the way he was playing the role that this was a gay homme fatale. Some really interesting ones evolved as the stranglehold of the Hays Office, the production code office, who censored films in Hollywood, began to weaken during the course of this cycle of films in the 40s and 50s. By 1955, there was an interesting film called The Big Combo, a B picture, a low-budget picture, but a very good one, that has a gay male couple in it who are the assassins. They are the hired assassins. And every scene gives ample evidence of their relationship with each other. There's even elements of dialogue that surprise people that got through the censors to indicate their relationship with each other. And Quentin Tarantino in Pulp Fiction paid homage to this couple, who were, by the way, played by Lee Van Cleef and Earl Holliman, actors you might recognize early in their careers. They're playing this gay couple assassin team. And there is a scene in The Big Combo where they are preparing themselves for their assignment in a hallway of an apartment building that Quentin Tarantino paid homage to, with Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta in a scene in Pulp Fiction. So that's from The Big Combo in 1955. And then lastly, we can look at some of the themes that you see generally in, and this is not a complete list, in these films. Notice that a lot of them are fairly negative: haunted past, cruel fate, the futility of life, frustration about one's class, one's social status, and the inability to climb higher, fear of the future. This isn't a complete list, but these are the kinds of themes that you see repeatedly in these noir films. And they were the kinds of things that resonated with people who were going through them in real life. So the audience who was watching these films in the theater in the 40s and 50s related to what was going on in these films in a way that they didn't relate to the escapist films during the Great Depression of the 1930s, which didn't head on address any of these issues in the way that the noir films did. So we need to turn to the Bibliography project itself. And ask the question, why create a subject bibliography? Can't everybody just Google all the information they could ever want? I've actually had a student come to the service desk in my library and say to me, why do I need to read a book? There is nothing that I can't find on the internet. And that is the presupposition that most people tend to have these days. And not just, the 20-somethings and the 30-somethings. Everyone seems to think that they can find everything they need on the web without having to have something like a bibliography. The short answer to that rhetorical question is no. Not everybody can Google all the information they could ever want. When I started this out, I was just doing a DIY course on film noir about 9-10 years ago. I began to just sort of get interested in this and started looking for information on my own, just to sort of learn something new about something that I didn't know much about. And as I began that study of film noir for myself, I couldn't find, and I started looking for one, and I couldn't find one all-inclusive kind of clearinghouse for bibliographic information on the subject. So I was left to Google for everything, to look into databases in the way that our students do, in the way that our faculties do. And I noticed further, after a while, that once I'm finding some things, some of which were a little difficult to get to, once I finally found them, everybody seemed to be citing the same kind of core of sources in everything that they wrote. So there was a small core of information packets, citations of articles and of books that everyone seemed to be going to. And I thought there has to be more than this, and maybe it's just because they're not having an easy time of finding anything other than the stuff that they're seeing referred to in something they've already read. So that's when I had to remind myself that, I'm a librarian. People who work in libraries, people who love libraries, people who have degrees in library science, we all have skills that mere mortals don't have. We have skills to find and vet information and connect our people with that information that other people do not have. It is a unique skill. It is the fundamental skill that we have as people who work in libraries. It kind of distresses me, and this is just a kind of an aside, it distresses me a little bit that as libraries decrease in prestige and funding these days, we've focused on trying to preserve our careers by selling our abilities at the latest emerging technology, or by latching onto the latest trend, thinking that that will make us appear more relevant to the powers that be who hold the purse strings and who hold our futures in their hands. We haven't been marketing very well the skills that we've always had and are still extremely valuable. We are still better at finding and vetting information and getting people connected with that information than anyone else is, because we're the ones who have that unique skill set. And that's something that I think should be marketed more. And a bibliography project like this is one step in helping to reinforce that notion. We'll get to some of the evidence of some of the proof of what I've just said in a little bit when we see the way that I had to defend the value of the bibliography project itself when trying to get it published, and for other reasons. We'll get to that in just a little bit. So, yes, I think creating a subject bibliography can be a valuable project to do in this day and age. And if you're thinking about starting one, the first thing that I would suggest that you do is to know your subject. Now, that seems obvious, but in point of fact, a lot of us have done LibGuides or done Pathfinders on demand for someone on a topic that we weren't really very intimate with, and we've done a good job with them. We were able to find and cobble together the right things to quickly satisfy the request for such an item, to point people to the right sections, the right collections of literature, the right information. But the more you know your subject, the more you're able to tease the esoterica out of the bibliographic universe. You know, this far-flung universe of ever-expanding publications. The more keywords, the more titles, the more names, the more themes, the more language you have about a particular subject, the more kinds of searches you can do, and the better able you will be to dig out the obscure stuff that's still valuable out there in the bibliographic universe. It's all about those nuanced terms that you know better the more you know your subject. Also, I'd say identify submittable publications. By that I mean, as you are doing your research for the subject matter yourself, reading these things, getting more knowledge about the subject matter, pay attention when you see the same journal 2 or 3 times or more. Because the more you see the same journal providing information on your subject matter, then you know that this may be a journal that I'll want to submit the project to when it's ready to be submitted for publication. So identify as you go the publications that you might want to submit to. Set realistic parameters. That's a tall order when you haven't started the project yet, but you need to kind of set some kind of parameters at the beginning of the project. In my case, I was looking at academic journals exclusively. I thought I want to stick with scholarly publications. I want to eliminate the movie reviews in the newspaper. I want to eliminate trade publications or a lot of popular magazine and newspaper pieces. I thought that would get me a more manageable set of citations to work with. I also decided to limit the subject matter to Hollywood films of this particular historical period, from 41-ish to 1959, not including any European noir films made in the period or any foreign language films made in the period that would qualify as noir, but stick with Hollywood productions from this time period and English language articles, no matter where they were published. I actually thought that I might find a few dozen at the beginning. And if a few dozen, I thought maybe the project will end up being a bibliographic essay of some sort of like a literature review chapter in a dissertation or thesis, which I thought might be more publishable than a list, than a list like a bibliography typically is. And barring that, if I started to find more, maybe I would go to an annotated bibliography. Still deal with the content of these things and describe it and sort of try to present something in a narrative form that talks about the literature on the subject. The adjust on the fly comes in my case, first with the realization that once I'd found about 200 articles, I knew that this was going to be way too large for either a bibliographic essay or an annotated bibliography, that I was going to have to just do a straight bibliography. And then as it kept growing and growing and growing, that's when I started wondering if I was going to have to split it in half. I didn't want to split it in half. I wanted to get all of the citations in one place so that researchers had only one place to do their search. I didn't want to split it chronologically in two because it got too large. By the end, I have 625 citations in this thing. It is generally too large for most journals to contain. I did get lucky in that regard. But that would have been an adjustment I might have had to make. And then once it got that large, one of the adjustments I was willing to make was that if it becomes too large for any publication to allow space for it, that I could always put it up as a web page, leaving it all intact, and it would still be then searchable in one place as one kind of catch-all location for citations on scholarly articles in film noir. I didn't want to do that if I didn't have to. That's an adjustment I could have made, but the problem for me with a web page versus a peer-reviewed journal publishing the bibliography is the credibility that it would have. Anything can appear on the web, and that would leave the vetting to the researchers, to the scholars, to determine whether or not that it was reliable information I was providing. That it's in a peer-reviewed journal gives researchers confidence that when they're searching my bibliography for sources that they're going to use in their research, that it's trustworthy information, that they're good citations, and that they're obtainable. And by the way, being able to get their hands on the articles was another criteria. If I couldn't get my hands on an article by finding it online, by getting it from a database, by getting it by an interlibrary loan request, I did not include it in the bibliography. Everything that's listed in the bibliography has to be something that any person who's using the bibliography as a resource to find the information that they're going to do their reading and research in has to be able to get their hands on the article by any of those conventional methods. So that was included in my criteria. Now, as I start going along and I start compiling this and it starts taking shape, I'm letting the citations that I'm finding dictate the kind of a shape that the bibliography is going to take. Then I begin thinking about getting it ready for publication. And once you start readying the bibliography for publication, you're going to have to think about not only the shape the bibliography is going to take, but you have to think about the narrative that you're going to write, explaining its shape, explaining what's in it, explaining its value. And that is the primary thing you have to do first, is justify the value of the project, justify the value of the bibliography that you choose to do. And this happens at two distinct mileposts in your whole journey, in your whole process. First and up front is, if you plan to use your bibliography project to satisfy the demand of your annual review or of your promotion and tenure process, you need to make sure that the powers that be, who hold the purse strings, who hold your career in their hands, will accept it, that they will see its value. Of course, my superiors in this academic library are all librarians. So I assumed up front that since they're librarians, they'll see the value of a bibliography project. I was actually mistaken about that. Again, because it's the 21st century. And until they are faced with the idea that a bibliography is still a valuable tool for librarians to use, for researchers to have in the 21st century, until they come face to face with that reality, it's a forgotten and archaic and anachronistic tool that was so 1 century ago. So when I just matter-of-factly, to satisfy a certain stage in my promotion and tenure review process, wrote that I was going to be doing a large-scale subject bibliography on film noir, the committee who was evaluating these submissions in the promotion and tenure process were dismissive of my project. And they use terms like it's derivative, doesn't count as real scholarship, it's not research. I didn't sell, it was my bad in that I didn't sell them on what the project was taking shape to be. I didn't let them know how large it was going to be. I didn't let them know that you realize that I have to research, I have to read everything that I find. I have to read all 625 articles and digest the information in them that the bibliography cites. I also had to read a couple of hundred that turned out not to fit the parameters of the bibliography, so I had to reject them from inclusion in the bibliography. That's a hell of a lot of research that I had to do, more research than a lot of the projects that are the Class A projects that they are looking for in this day and age, because it is a different kind of a project. It's not the kind of thing that people typically do on a regular basis, like they did 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And that shows my age a little bit. By the way, I'm old enough to remember when the head librarian at an academic library might be given the job title Professor of Bibliography. And remember that this very organization for whom I'm doing this presentation had the word bibliography in its name until just a year ago. So you have to have in mind that if you're going to do a bibliography project for some kind of review or promotion consideration, you may have to sell the powers that be up front on its value, and make sure that they have bought in before you spend your time and effort doing the project. Because if they're not going to buy into it, if they're going to get adamant and say, no, we reject this out of hand, then you're going to be doing it on your own for your own edification and your own contribution to academia, to the community that deals with the subject matter, and do something else in order to, notch your gun, as it were. The second place you're going to have to justify its value is in the introductory essay that you write at the beginning of the bibliography itself. The narrative that you write has to include a justification of the value of the bibliography at hand, both for the editors who look at it when you submit it to a publication, and for the reader who is going to decide whether or not they're going to use this to assist them in their research. The justification of the value of the bibliography really is an important element, and really probably ought to be the first thing that you say. You wouldn't have had to say that. It wouldn't have had to be the first thing that you talked about in your descriptive essay of the bibliography project 50 or 100 years ago. But I think in the 21st century, that's where we are. Justify its value at the beginning of the bibliography project so that everyone who reads it, from your supervisor to the editors of a journal to the reader who's doing research on your subject matter, everyone knows the value of the bibliography project that you've cobbled together. You also need to, in your introductory essay, describe the contents. So this is where you're going to tell them what your parameters were, what's in and what's out. The reader needs to know, the researcher needs to know what to expect, what they can reasonably expect to find in the bibliography and what they won't find in the bibliography. So they'll know how to use the bibliography for the best results that they have for the research that they're doing. And then be prepared to tweak, to revise, to rewrite, to restructure, to reformat, to otherwise make changes to please the editors once you get a journal interested in the project. You probably won't have someone accept it out of hand. There'll be some back and forth. There'll be some editing involved. So be prepared to accommodate the editors. Once someone's interested in it, doesn't mean that your work is done. You're going to continue to negotiate with them, to have a relationship with them, and if you've got good and responsive editors and attentive and detail-oriented, all the better for you, because your finished project, when it's published, will look better in the end if you've had more of those negotiative, relational kinds of interactions with them. So once you've prepared the bibliography, its introductory essay, and yourself for the submission phase. You're ready to begin to run the gauntlet of submission. And it is a gauntlet. You would be unique if you completed a project and submitted it to your first choice journal, and they accepted it immediately with no changes and published it as you sent it to them. I don't know anyone who's had that experience. You need to be prepared for some rejection, maybe a lot of rejection. You can't be overly thin-skinned about your project if you're going to engage in this kind of a project, because you will submit and reject and submit and reject, and it is a serialized process. You can only submit to one journal at a time. You have to wait for them to accept or reject it before you can submit to another. Meanwhile, you keep working on it, but you can't send it to 12 different journals all at the same time and then take the best offer. You're not allowed to do that. They will, in fact, require you to certify when you submit, in most cases, that no one else has this, no one else is looking at it, and it hasn't been published anywhere else. So the submission rejection process is something that you just sort of have to gird your loins for, to be ready for. In my case, it was an 11-month process. I submitted my project to 7 publications over the course of the 11 months. I was looking first for open access journals that I thought could handle the size of it, because it was already larger than the 10,000 word maximum that most journals seem to adhere to. Some of them gave me thoughtful responses, said this is just not the kind of thing that we can handle, or it's too large. One journal that I won't name, I simply got a single word response from the editor: no. And the 6th journal that I submitted it to was actually a very interesting one. I submitted it to, there's a curious and interesting open access journal. Everything is published in English. That is called Acta Universitatis Sapientiae. Forgive my Latin, that's as bad as my French. It's the Film and Media Studies of Sapientia, Hungarian University of Transylvania. They publish everything in English, and they cover a broad spectrum of arts and sciences. It is an open access journal, and I somehow really thought it would be cool to have my project published by a Romanian journal. I don't know why. I just kind of thought that would be interesting. And I got the most thoughtful response from the editor of that journal, who regretted that they couldn't fit it in, and he wished me well, and that was just an interesting little sidelight in my experience of submission and rejection. And it happened to be the very next journal I submitted to, which is Postscript, which is essays in film and the humanities. It's been around for about 4 decades. Postscript has handled bibliographies large and larger than mine in the past, and they accepted it after some significant negotiation. It was about 2 years worth of negotiation for them. They at first asked me the question, why do we need another bibliography on film noir? And it was my response to that, and it was a back and forth response over the course of several months that was required to finally convince them that they could allow this project space in their journal. In other words, I had to sell the editors of Postscript on the value of this bibliography project. And when we look at the bibliography itself, I can show you it was a quantitative proof that finally put me over the edge with them. So let's look at the bibliography itself, and we can see how it looks and see that introductory paragraph decrying or displaying the value of the bibliography project that finally got me over the hump. Okay, this is the project as it appears in the print journal. It's now been out, like I say, 3 or 4 weeks. And this is what the print edition looks like. Notice that the title, that is a play on words from a noir film called In a Lonely Place. It's any film noir scholar will recognize the reference, and they'll be drawn to it if they just see this listed in a table of contents or a citation somewhere. Their eye will be drawn to it because of the title. And then the subtitle, of course, explicates what it is that the bibliography does. It is a selected bibliography of scholarly articles on film noir 1946 to 2019. In the beginning, by the way, I started this project in 2017. So my chronology went from 1946 to 2016. And that was its size, that was its range when I first submitted it to all of these journals. By the time Postscript accepted it, in 2018, they wanted me to go back and bump it up to at least through 2017 or 2018 if I could. That's often difficult, you'll find, because indexing does not take place for articles published in a given year for several months after the year is over. And in the case of this one, this came out in late May of 2021. You'll notice that the publication date is volume 40, is number 1. The publication date is 2020. So this wouldn't have been indexed itself until 5 months after the year is over. So in 2018, I couldn't rightly go past 2017. A publication delay bumped this from an issue in volume 39 to volume 40, issue 1. So that led them to ask me to bump it up again to 2018 and eventually through 2019 when the pandemic came along, because that delayed publication for another several months. So I was going back and forth with the layout editor and with the general editors for months over this thing, and eventually had to go back on multiple occasions to do new research to replicate all of the searching I had done in all of the nooks and crannies I had searched, to add a publication year here and a publication year there. So now the finished product goes from 1946 to 2019. This introductory paragraph I mentioned, right here at the beginning, doesn't every book ever published on the subject include a bibliography? Why do we need another bibliography in film noir? I'm taking the editor's question and putting it right at the beginning of the introductory material. And this paragraph is my response. The kicker ultimately was this. I pointed out that most of the bibliographies that one finds in books and articles on film noir are essentially lists of works cited in the publication at hand. They are not complete subject bibliographies on film noir. And beyond that, I pointed out that the annual bibliography of film studies that is produced by J.P. Talat, who is one of the general editors, the scholar I mentioned before, the most prolific film noir scholar in history, compiles an annual bibliography of film studies for Postscript. It often ranges more than 1,000 citations of what was published on film studies in the previous year. And J.P. Talat, the best researcher on film and certainly on film noir of all, was not able to find a third of as many of the film noir articles as I found for this bibliography project. The proof came in this. I did a check of his bibliography and mine over a 15-year span from 2004 to 2018, and J. Talat found 72 articles on film noir in that 15-year period, and I found 260. That's what got me into Postscript. That quantitative proof that I was able to find more stuff because I'm a librarian than J.P. Talat, the noted researcher in film, was able to find. Now, Jay never makes any claims that his annual bibliography of film studies is exhaustive. He doesn't claim that, never has. But film scholars use his annual bibliography of film studies as if it is exhaustive. They sometimes use that as a substitute for a one-stop shop for citations of works in their field of study. So this just shows the value of this particular subject bibliography, shows the value of the skill set that librarians, that people who work in libraries and love libraries have to find information and vet information and present it, that we do better than the rest of the world does when it comes to finding and vetting information. And that's one of the values, the primal value of this particular subject bibliography project, that did get published because of that argument right there. The rest of the introductory material here indicates, talks about the parameters, talks about what's in and what's out, doesn't try to go too far in explaining what I think film noir is, but just my criteria for what would be included and what wasn't. Ultimately, I had to decide when I was searching all the various titles of films that might be included, that might be covered. I needed to make some decisions about what was going to be the authoritative list, given that there isn't really a canon of noir films from the period of the 40s and 50s. And I ended up using the most recent edition of the Film Noir Encyclopedia as kind of my barometer. If their large section on the classic period of noir films did not include a film, then I wouldn't include it in the bibliography. Their listing is generous enough. There are films in there that I wouldn't, and a lot of people wouldn't consider noir films, but they include them. And so that kind of made it a safe place to go to refer to whether or not something was considered in or out as a critical essay on a noir film, or a film claimed to be a noir film from the cycle. And in the end, I end up mentioning that I relied on the titles of the articles to describe the contents of the articles, that for the most part one could understand the gist of an article based on what the title says the article is. In the cases where the article title did not indicate the content of the article itself, I would include a bracketed descriptive notes. So of the 625 total citations, 225 included such descriptive notes. We can look at some examples of those here. For example, this is what the citations look like. I submitted this originally in a kind of a modified Chicago Manual of Style citation style. Postscript generally follows MLA. I say generally because they have their own kinds of proprietary differences. And we ended up having to change some things about all 625 of these citations to make it fit their style. That's, again, one of the things that you have to sort of prepare yourself to do to get a project like this published. Here's an example of an article, Eric Avila's Popular Culture in the Age of White Flight, Film Noir, Disneyland, and the Cold War Suburban Imaginary. Well, that doesn't necessarily tell someone what the article is about, so I've got a bracketed comment that says it uses film noir and Disneyland to expose structural and cultural transformation in mid-century American urban life. That's the kind of bracketed descriptions that I will include when the title doesn't tell the reader what the article is about. And that's about as long as any of them get. So it's not thoroughgoing, it's not an annotation, it's just a brief descriptive phrase to let them know what it is that they're going to find in the article. There are a lot of see also and pointing comments that will send people to other articles that are within. There's often an argument or a conversation between scholars that will be exchanges in different journal articles. So if there's a conversation, like here's one here, Richard Allen critiques Dana Poland and refers to the publication that was critiqued. Some will be references to other articles that are also cited within here, and I'll have a see also reference right here in the bracketed descriptor at the end of the citation. I should point out that the HTML versions, and this is searchable, the PDF version is searchable. So if I wanted to find John Houseman, for example, I could use the control find feature. John Houseman, that's a name that a lot of you may even know. Here's a reference to a reaction to John Houseman's two 1947 articles criticizing post-war appearance of hard-boiled films. See Houseman below. This is a see also reference. So we can click on that and go to, here's the John Houseman articles, and here are his 3 articles that he's listed in here, 2 of which are from 1940, actually all 3 are from 1947. Before it was even called film noir. They had to come up with other terms to describe these films. Ironically, by the way, Houseman is very critical of these films in 1947, and he was within 2 years producing noir films. That's just a casual aside. So the PDF version, if and when you ever see it, is searchable with the control find option. The HTML versions, of course, are always searchable, and the HTML versions tend to be the way that databases who include PostScript will present it. So in the case of the Gale Literature Resource Center, here's the bibliography. Notice that it's 16,201 words. That's way too long for most journals. I'm grateful that PostScript was able to handle the heft of this thing. Here is the HTML version, and again, it's all searchable. It's just continuous HTML text, and we can find Houseman in here. And there's the same references. We'll see them, in the same order. And here's John Houseman's 3 articles. One thing that you need to, and I hadn't prepared for this, I hadn't taken this into account. If you're doing a project like this or any kind of a project, one of the things that does not translate to the HTML, at least in these Gale products, is the italicization. Notice that all the film titles, all of the journal titles, are italicized. We can look at the John Allen article. Double Indemnity is italicized. It's a reference to the film Double Indemnity, a policy that paid off. And Literature Film Quarterly is italicized. If we look for John Allen here, if I would type it correctly, notice that Double Indemnity is not italicized, neither is the title of the journal. There are no italics in this HTML version of my bibliography. That's one issue. So you have to kind of account for that in your head, even though there's really not much you can do about it. But another thing that you can account for in some ways is CJK characters do not translate. Chinese, Japanese, Korean characters do not translate. So if you have any journal titles, for example, we can look at Yukari Tamazaki's article, Timepieces and the Sense of Time in Noir. This is the title of the journal in these Japanese characters. The transliteration of it is Cultural and Scientific Research, which I put in parentheses just as a convenience. Little did I know how important that could end up being. Timepieces and Sense of Time in Film Noir, notice that the Japanese characters are omitted. Just says phrase omitted. Same with Chinese characters. So if we go and look at, say, Seon Kim's article, the Korean characters that you see here do not translate. Again, you have phrase omitted. So the transliteration that I provided is ultimately helpful. The criteria for how I was going to provide information in these citations is that I wanted the information to be sufficient so that if anyone had to obtain this article by interlibrary loan request, all the information necessary for the interlibrary loan request is here. And even with the CJK characters omitted, with this transliteration, that's enough for them to get their hands on the article. It's enough for their ILL person to be able to get the article for them and get it in their hands either by mail or by PDF in an email. So that ended up being a fortunate thing. I'm glad I did that. Diacritics are another thing that will not appear. So if you have any European or Vietnamese names or others with lots of diacritics, they'll just be, I think this is an example right here. I think there was a diacritic on that C in this one that, yes, Well, no, not on this one. But on Jalacha there is. Tijana Jalacha, and notice the title of this journal has diacritics in it. We can look for that one in the HTML version. No diacritics on the name, no diacritics on the name of the journal. So this is still enough information for them to be able to get their hands on it, to be able to find it. But it is a bit of a frustration that kind of detail that you pay attention to when you're compiling the bibliography may be lost when it's translated to an HTML format. So that's a brief look at the bibliography itself, and you can see some of its usefulness. And again, that argument to show its value in the beginning is extremely important at every step of the way, at every stage of the process, to make sure that you justify the value of the project before you go any further with it, before you submit it to anyone, before you claim it in your promotion and tenure or your annual review process. That's all the time really I can allow for this here. This is again a replica of the presentation that was made back in June 11th. If you have any questions of me about film noir or about a bibliography project, feel free to contact me. You can use the university email address. I created this film noir bib email address in case I was going to have to post this as a web page. Since this is an official scholarly publication in a peer-reviewed, refereed journal, I had no problems with you just contacting me in this simple first initial last name at gsu.edu email address. Hopefully you got a little bit of information out of this, and especially some inspiration. I hope it has inspired somebody somewhere to think about, yeah, a bibliography project on this pet issue, this pet subject of mine might have some value because I haven't seen anything like it. I would encourage you to try your hand at it. I think these are the kinds of things that still have value in the 21st century, and are the kinds of things that we need to be marketing to the powers that be in our institutions as one of the unique skills that we possess, and that they should still be valuing as part and parcel of their institution. Thank you so much.